professor to be looking into. And people, I mean, at the time, if you look at a Google Ngram for the word mind control or brainwashing, they were very low, around the turn of the century or the 1990s. After there was a peak of interest in the 70s, and it just really fallen off. But I guess I was interested because it just seems so unusual, and like maybe there was something there that people hadn't really thought about. And at the time, these documents weren't readily available, and like you say, people weren't really looking into it. So I just thought it seemed like a rich area for research. And I'm also interested in connecting I've always been interested in connecting my personal I guess, my goals for life with what I research. So I thought it's almost like a philosophical and existential question of how much we're controlled or how much we might be controlled. And it seemed important to look at some of the more extreme cases, if you could.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect of it. Like, how much are we controlled, and how arrogant are we to think that we're not controlled? Or how arrogant are we to think that wouldn't work on me?
Yeah, I think that's embedded in our, in the messages we receive all the time, that freedom is something kind of effortless that we're just granted, and that autonomy is just the natural state. But actually, we're so much more malleable than we think. And these things, if you look around yourself, or if you observe yourself, you'll often see this to be true. That's what also drew me to anthropology, is just the idea, like, if I was born in another place at another time, I would be another person, or how much of me would be transferable was right. What that interested me. And that's why I first started studying anthropology. Like, how much are we shaped by things that we don't necessarily choose, or are maybe accidental or genetic or various factors. But but I think we're told that that freedom of choice or our autonomy is fairly straightforward, and all you have to do is exert your will.
Yeah, but clearly we're influenced heavily by our environment, culturally. I mean, accents, just cultural traditions, behavior patterns. It begs the questions like, what are you, and what is the shell that you wear on the outside? Like a hermit crab. Like, what do you carry around with you, and what, at the core of it, what are you?
Yeah, that is the oldest question of Socrates. Who am I? Or just the question. It's a deep question, and it's also kind of like a practical question. So I thought if you could look at it more in actual examples, that would be interesting. And I guess I was drawn to the topic. Maybe because other people weren't studying it, or also because of experiences in my life, just seemingly small things. Like one day, I remember when I was in graduate school, I was walking down the street and I said, we passed a small dog, and I said, I really hate small dogs. Like, and I realized as I said it that it wasn't true, but I had just I actually really like them. What's wrong with small dogs? But I had absorbed this opinion from somewhere that, like, a person that such as I was aspiring to be, only liked big dogs or something like that. But just noticing in yourself the way you soak up opinions, and you're shaped by even seemingly trivial things, and then also on a more profound level, you can see that happening. Made me wonder, like, what could you learn from looking at these cases where people really seem to have been brainwashed, in history, or radically reshaped, perhaps.
And then there's brainwashing yourself, because if you say I hate small dogs, now you have to kind of defend it. And and even if you say, oh, God, it's not even true, but there's got to be reasons to hate small dogs. I don't want to come off as a moron who just says things.
There are other people who feel the same.
Yeah.
It turns out, maybe either you end up doubling down on that opinion because you don't want to feel silly to yourself. I mean, I think sometimes we're just a series of adopted opinions that we then adhere to. And I guess being in graduate school also made me feel that way, because you're rapidly learning and absorbing a new vocabulary, learning things you should say, learning things you shouldn't say, ways you should express yourself and ways you shouldn't. That seemed very like a deeply shaping process. And I was interested in how did social sciences, like, was there a science of this process of shaping, or they sometimes called it canalizing, or making, a canal of behavior so that people would end up wanting to do what it was that socially necessary for them to do.
Well, universities are a great place for that, right? Because you get away from your parents for the first time, who have indoctrinated you into their cult. Like, you were born into the cult of your parents, and then you leave, and they're like, let me get away from these crazy people,
Yeah.
and now I'm going to become a whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And now I'm going to figure out which group most aligns with my ideas and join them and rebel and fight against the machine and become a part of a new cult.
Exactly. Wear something different, or adopt. I don't like certain kinds of dogs, or I wear a certain thing, or you have an interruption in the fabric of your extensive conditioning, and that is it's also an opportunity. It's not a nefarious thing necessarily, but it can take that truth about people.
I think it can be nefarious for some people, unfortunately. But I think for a lot of people, just considering new ways to think about things is probably valuable. It's probably a good thing to have the opportunity to reconsider the way that you've sort of like canaled the grooves that have been deeply carved into your personality, where you automatically go towards certain things or think about certain things.
I always think just an interruption is often good.
Oh yeah.
In your patterning.
Yeah, that's why I think moving is really good.
Or traveling, or
yeah,
a bunch of resets.
I've read that you have had a steady meditation practice. I read it was like 2 hours a day for 25 years.
Yeah.
That's a lot of time to be meditating.
Yeah, it really helped me so much when I learned to meditate that I never wanted to miss an hour. So I've never missed an hour, except when I was giving birth to my daughter, which was its own thing. But
you get a break for the meditation for that. You get a hall pass.
And it's not like anyone made me, or I necessarily thought I would do that. It's just that it's something that gave me a lot of perspective and peace, and I guess I just didn't want to go back. So I do think it informs how I do research, or I try to bring what I learn in meditation into what I do.
Do you do an hour in the morning and an hour at night?
Yeah.
Wow.
And for a year, I think a couple of times I tried adding more in the morning, so 2 hours or so in the morning and an hour in the evening or something, which has an effect, but it's hard to make room in your life sometimes.
Oh, for sure.
But you can sleep a little bit less.
Yeah?
Well, you don't want to make yourself sleep less, but sometimes it just does reduce the amount you need.
Just by meditating?
That's
Really?
what I found.
Interesting. How much sleep do you need?
I used to sleep like 8.5 hours, and then now I sleep about 7 or 6.5, or if I'm really tired, I might sleep a little extra, but I ended up just, it's so much changed my life that I just, I move things around so I could always do it, and try to be adaptable. So I just mostly get up at a regular meditation time, which is like 4:30.
What kind of meditation?
I do Vipassana, which is a form of Buddhist meditation. It's just a form of observation, or someone once described it as practice in seeing things as they are. So you try to it's not trying to, apply a lens over something or chanting. It's just it's cultivating observation of the subtle body, ultimately, or just what is in front of you.
And so you just sit in peace and think?
Well, it's not always peaceful. There is sometimes, but thought.
I mean, peace as far as like you're not bouncing around.
Sometimes I'm sitting, sometimes I've also had, I've adapted, so when my daughter was little, sometimes I'd hold her or be putting her to sleep or something, but mostly I'm just sitting there and with eyes closed, and then you kind of move, you observe just how you are, and the more you practice it, the more you can kind of go into it more deeply, quickly.
I would think that would be a good protection from unwanted mind control too, but
Yeah.
at least you could kind of have an assessment, do an audit of your thoughts, and sit back and go, how much of the shit I believe is because of X or because of Y?
Yeah, it's like a built-in reflection. So, the end of the day, I have to say I'm often less still or peaceful. My mind's jumping around, and I'm like processing. Maybe it's even what I watched or was exposed to, and it's sort of a processing experience. And sometimes you're super distracted, but you can also notice that fact. So it just builds in, an opportunity for some distance, which then you can also try to bring into your life, too.
Were you, when you were young, had you ever been exposed to any cults or anything like that?
That's a good question. Not when I was really young.
Like, how old were you when you were first exposed to cults?
In fact, I think, so that's a good question. I mean, my family is sort of cult averse, I would say. My father, I think they had friends once, in later life. My parents had these friends who got involved in a large group awareness training, which is somewhat culty. And they take you in and you're not allowed to use the bathroom, and they lock you, kind of like keep you in a room until you're really uncomfortable and start to have revelations about how you could change your life. And these are, it's stuff like
How long did they make you not go to the bathroom?
it's to the point where it's uncomfortable. I can't remember. It's a long afternoon going into the evening, and often people come out kind of converted, and my parents' friends actually did, and they did change their lives in various ways. So they said, you have to come. And my dad, in the middle of it, he said, I have to go to the bathroom, and he's like, I'm out of here. He just left. So I figured he was not programmable in that way.
Well, I feel like any group that doesn't want you to go to the bathroom is stupid.
It's probably a sign.
Yeah, there's no reason to not go to the bathroom if you have to go to the bathroom. That's ridiculous.
I mean, it is typical of certain groups where they start to constrain your and people who might be willing to remain in that uncomfortable state and be constrained will end up staying longer, and it's sort of a self-selecting process, maybe.
That makes sense, right? The people that are more willing to comply.
Yeah, and I guess with me, maybe the first brush with a cult would be something like the various yoga teachers I've worked with.
Oh, so many of them were so culty.
Yeah. There's one kind of funny story is I got very into yoga when I was living in Oakland, also in graduate school, and I would go. It was really helpful with school just to have a very physical, demanding practice, but there was a whole community around it, and it turned out that the teacher was sleeping with many of the students, but I just didn't know it. I thought he was I don't know. I just thought he was. I admired him. I brought my boyfriend at the time he came to pick me up after class, and he said something like, and he's now my husband, he said, I just got the vibe that everyone there is sleeping with everybody else, and I was shocked. I was like, no, that's not happening. But it actually was. So you could say it's a bit, I don't think it was a cult, but it certainly was a scandal.
Yeah. I had the exact same experience. The first time I started taking yoga, there was a guy who was a yoga teacher who I have always been very wary of control and controlling people and those kind of environments, and that this guy was like, there was something inauthentic about his spirituality that greased me the wrong way. I was like, yuck. Like, just the way he would chant and the things he would say. There was just too much ego involved. And then I found out he was banging all students. And I was like, of course he is. I knew it. Because my wife roped me into going to the class. That was the first time I went. I was like, I really like the stretching. It's like really great. I really like yoga itself as a practice. But I mean, the problem is these people that are, and it's kind of the problem with everything. Like when one person is in control, and one person is the person who gets to lead the class, and then they get praise heaped upon them by the students, and then they start to think that they deserve it, and then they don't have a lot of self-reflection, and they're not very objective, and then they sort of revel in it and enjoy it, and the next thing you know, they're taking advantage of it, and it's like...
Yeah, it's very helpful to have that defense radar
Yeah.
of a certain kind. Also, sometimes I think these prominent teachers, they have had some sort of, I don't want to say enlightenment experience, but some sort of breakthrough, something that felt profound to them, because many people do. We now know that these experiences are incredibly common, and yet, so they take that as a kind of license. Well, now I must be enlightened, or what I have to take the mantle, my people are awaiting this, or they sort of then justify things they wouldn't otherwise.
Spiritual
do.
narcissism.
Yeah, it can actually engender that because of, and I think there's this has been described too. Spiritual narcissism is a good phrase, though.
It's legit.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see a lot of it. There's a lot of it in the psychedelic community, a lot of it in the meditation community, a lot of it in the yoga community. So they just start thinking that they're better than people that don't do it.
Yeah, it feels very special. If you have a special experience, it's really dangerous. It becomes very dangerous, and afterwards to not have it feed your ego. And even if you had a profound breakdown of the ego when you were in a psychedelic state.
It is fascinating to me, though, that you can tell the difference for the most part, if you're really paying attention, between someone who's authentically expressing their real thoughts versus someone who's saying things that they think if they say these things, they will get praise or they will get attention or you will think that they're profound. We know bullshit. Humans know. There's like a smell to it, a feel to it, if you're paying attention.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, it's just like some people have big ears, some people have small ears. Some people just are not that good at picking up on that stuff for whatever reason. Life experience, they have been burned enough times, like whatever it is. And, that's where cults get started. And I'm fascinated by cults. I've always been fascinated by them because I've watched I don't know how many documentaries on cults. And in the beginning, it looked so fun. That's the problem. Did you ever see the documentary Wild Wild Country, the Netflix series?
Yes.
It's amazing, right? In the beginning, you're like, they look like they're having a great time.
Yeah.
They're all dancing together and playing drums and having a party and eating together. And it's like a sense of community. And
This episode is brought to you by Uber Eats. Summer is almost here, and you can now get almost anything you need for your sunny days delivered with Uber Eats. What do I mean by almost? Well, you can't get a well-groomed lawn delivered, but you can get chicken parmesan delivered. Catamaran, that's a no. Lemon meringue, that's a yes. A day in the sun, no. A bottle of rum, yes. Uber Eats can definitely help you out with that. Get almost anything delivered with Uber Eats. Order now. For alcohol, you must be legal drinking age. Please enjoy responsibly.
Voted, or they want to maintain that ocean.
Well, also, what was her name? Stella?
Yeah.
Was there? Yeah, she was so crazy.
She's
she was poisoning people. And she was such a great villain that it made him, because if she wasn't in the documentary, he would be the villain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She pulls the focus.
Yes. Yeah, most certainly. And the fact that she's still alive, too. That sort of helps as well.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's a default thing in the human psyche because of our ancient history of living in tribes. That human beings have been very tribal, and I think being a part of a tribe, one of the things that happens is you sort of have to go along with the way everybody else is doing things. If you want to fit in, you want to adapt, and especially if you're growing up in the tribe, you don't know any different. This is the only group, and being ostracized from the tribe and kicked out is like, oh my goodness, that's the worst thing in the world. Now you're alone, you have to fend for yourself, there's no way you can. You have to protect yourself from the wilderness and the animals and the elements and predators and other humans, and so you have to, it's very dangerous to be alone, so you have to adapt to the tribe itself.
I think that's true. Yeah, small scale societies have to, even the word cult in its technical or dictionary definition doesn't necessarily mean abusive organization. It just means small scale religious group that maybe, I think people deeply yearn for that sense of belonging, and that's why it does look so fun, and by all reports is very fun to get inducted into a cult. People get these exhilarated states. They often have altered experiences of altered consciousness, and they're empowered by it too.
Well, fun fact, before I bought the place that I put my comedy club on 6th Street, I was under contract for a theater called the One World Theater that was run by this cult. And I kind of vaguely heard about it. And my friend Ron told me that the theater's amazing. You should buy it. Because we were talking about buying a comedy club. You should buy that place. And so I got under contract, and my friend Adam called me up. He goes, "Have you seen the documentary on that cult?" I'm like, "Oh no, there's a documentary? That's never good. That's never good, and it's really bad." The documentary is called Holy Hell, and it's about this guy who's a hypnotist, a yoga teacher, and a gay porn star. And that's a 1, 2, 3 combination. And he started out as cult in West Hollywood. And then after Waco, after that went down, the Cult Awareness Network started really cracking down, and they were investigating him. So he changed his name and moved to Austin and had his followers build him this theater. Fortunately, I got out of the deal. But
I guess he was selling it.
well, he was gone. It had already fallen apart. The cult had completely fallen apart. But what's fascinating is in the documentary, in the beginning, again, it looks amazing. They're all cooking together and eating together and doing yoga, and they look so happy. And let's just be honest. Modern society, the day-to-day grind, keeping up with the Joneses, the stuck in traffic and doing things you hate under fluorescent lights in a cubicle all day long is not attractive. Not only is it not attractive, it makes cults attractive. And these people were longing for something that was this is stupid. The way your parents lived is stupid. The way all these people live in society, the way Thoreau described men living lives of quiet desperation, that sucks.
Yeah.
You don't have to live like that, man. Come live with us, man.
Yeah.
And this guy was able to do this thing called the knowing. And the knowing it was very difficult to get. People wanted it and he wouldn't give it to them. But when he would give it to you, you would sit there and he would put his hands, like his thumbs, on your head and touch you. And these people would go into this intense state of bliss that even after they did this documentary, even after they realized he was a charlatan and they left the cult, and they said that moment was the greatest moment of their life. When because of the power of suggestion, the way the human mind anticipated this event and then built up to it, and then when it finally happened, this endogenous burst of whatever it is in the mind. I don't know which chemicals were being released, but these people claim that they contacted God for this brief moment where this man touched them. They kind of understood everything.
Yeah.
Briefly. So it kind of worked, even though he was having sex with everybody. Not only was he having sex with these people, he was charging them. He would charge these guys for therapy and then have sex with them.
Yeah.
And, and they would talk about it afterwards. Like, thanks a lot. It was so horrible. Because, the documentary is so bad. At the end of the documentary, it's like, I got to get out of this deal. There's not enough sage in the world to burn off the bad juju that happened in this joint.
That's true.
Yeah, so it just felt like, horrible.
The life cycle of a cult has that, what you just described, and sometimes accelerated, but sometimes it plays out slower over time. But a lot of times people are very confused on leaving if they're taken out as maybe even children rescued by FBI from abusive groups, or people who manage to escape abusive cults. They still have trouble evaluating their positive experiences because the positive is so good,
right? And
disentangling it and you feel that you need to delegitimize that too. But I think so. That's why I think therapy can be helpful as someone who's experienced with cult ex-members.
I think the problem also is that it's their only community. And if you have to leave your only community and then just strike it out in the world, and you've been with this community for 20 years or whatever it is,
right?
What do you do? How do you do it? How do you find peace?
Yeah.
How do you find companionship? How do you find that sense of camaraderie that's so deeply embedded in a tight-knit small community?
And a lot of times when you come out, if it's, say it was 18 or 20 years or a large portion of your middle life, maybe you went in as a young person, you come out and you don't know don't know how to operate things. You don't have the right. You're not comfortable with new technologies. You feel. I think that it's really a terrible experience for a lot of people, and they still grapple with it many years later, readjusting to society, because the critique they had originally, which was profound, as you were saying, not wanting to live a life of quiet desperation, that's still there.
Right.
Critique, but it just wasn't answered.
I always say, like, someone come up with a really good cult and I'll join. Come up with one that, like, you answer all the questions, but you don't try to control me, and you're just nice. Isn't there a cult where someone's not trying to have sex with everybody and not trying to steal all your money? Isn't it possible to do that? Just to, like, get together a group of like-minded individuals, and I guess that would be more of a commune. But even that, there's always some generally male leader who ruins everything.
It does seem to be, I think, there seemed to be in the 70s so many cults and back to the land groups, and some of the back to land stories are also, have many cautionary sides to them, and many of the aspects of cults.
What is the back to the land?
So just people leaving the city, heading out to the country, and starting an intentional community, I guess, would be what you're describing, with the idea that we're going to collectively raise our children, sell hammocks, or make our own jam, or you could say even monasteries maybe aspire to this. Some kind of religious organizations also have that intentional quality, and so I've done some research into some of these, because you wouldn't consider them cults necessarily, but they can end up having some of those qualities, such as sexual, just the demand that people have sex with each other, which tends to just create a lot of chaotic circumstances.
Why do you think it always involves that?
Why does it always go that way? I don't know. I mean, it's very interesting, because I even read Norman Kahn's classic History of Millennialism, which are a lot of groups from the Middle Ages and afterwards, that a Christian sects where they would break off, and including things like the Children's Crusade and others, and they often would end up with a kind of free love, even though they're very devout and extreme and sort of devoted to giving up their worldly possessions. There was sometimes this component of this kind of sexual freedom that would end up having destructive outcomes.
Do you think that is just because of just genetics, just the encoded desire to spread your seed, because life is very fragile, and especially in tribal life, when you're going back to the hunter-gatherer days, people didn't live very long, and it was very difficult to, like, have you ever read John Marco Allegro's, any of his work?
No.
He wrote The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, which is a fascinating book about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he's got a very controversial perspective on Christianity. And his perspective was, and this guy was an ordained minister who was agnostic, because he was an ordained minister, but then we started studying theology. He started seeing all these parallels to all these various religions. And he was like, well, clearly, like, it's not one religion has it right. There's something in all these things, but it's not like I am a Catholic and that's it, or I'm a Muslim and that's it. He was like, there's something here that exists throughout all of them, this constant thread. So he gets hired to be one of the people that deciphers the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is, parchment, which is, animal skins, and they have to do you know the whole story behind it? They found them in these clay clay pots in Qumran, and these caves, and it turns out to be like some of the oldest works of the Bible.
Yeah.
Well, he deciphers it for 14 years, and after 14 years, his conclusion is that the entire religion was based on fertility rituals and the consumption of psychedelic mushrooms, and that all of this had been sort of hidden in parables and stories, but he maintains that the root of it all was all about these people and these cults of fertility rituals and consuming psychedelic mushrooms. And he even brought he traced the word Christ back to, and this is very controversial, controversial for Christians with your hackles up. I'm not saying I agree with this. But he traced the word Christ back to an ancient Sumerian word which meant a mushroom covered in God's semen. The idea was that when it rained, it was God fertilizing the earth, and that these mushrooms would like instantaneously rise. Like they would go to bed, and in the morning the mushrooms would be there where they weren't there before. They would consume these mushrooms and have these intense psychedelic experiences, and then they tried to hide this stuff from the Romans. And so they hid it in parables and they hid it in stories. But this is what his belief was.
Well, it kind of reminds me what you're describing, which I haven't read, but I think it reminds me a little of Aldous Huxley's idea of the perennial philosophy, which is that there's, if you study across religions, you can find certain traits and properties that all share, and he wrote a whole book describing what that was. Then his last book that he wrote before he died was called The Island, and it was sketching out what he believed would be just what you described, a non-abusive, a place where a small-scale community where humans could flourish and it wouldn't involve, including, and it would avoid sexual abuse. And one of the features I always remember from this, which maybe relates to what you're saying, is that he said there would be trained parrots on all the trees, and every 15 minutes or so they would say attention, which would remind people to pay attention. In other words, to break that tendency we all have to succumb to, loops of conditioning and things like that. Because I think, as you're saying, fertility is a natural part of human life and often worshipped.
With how much of privacy is being invaded online, VPNs are no longer just a nice thing to have. It's a necessity. Some people think, I don't need a VPN because I have nothing to hide. But that's exactly what data brokers want you to think, because their profits depend on you having nothing to hide. What you do online is your business, and if you want to keep it your business, you need ExpressVPN. With ExpressVPN, 100% of your online activity travels through secure, encrypted servers. It hides your IP address, so no one can use it to track and sell your online activity, and your privacy is restored. ExpressVPN is also a great tool to secure your sensitive information from hackers. If you're using public Wi-Fi, like at a hotel, airport, or coffee shop, anyone can hijack your connection and access your most sensitive information. With ExpressVPN, you know that your passwords and banking...
The traditions that his parents had brought him up in Catholicism that he'd been raised in he just felt that he lacked meaning in his life. He felt like reality was over there and he was separated from it by, there was like a saran wrap over everything. So he felt somewhat alienated, but he didn't know what the answer would be. He kind of yearned for a religious experience. And he went out to California, and I think he was at a concert at university in Santa Barbara, and he saw this group walking through during intermission, and they were wearing these robes and chanting, and it was right after the Manson trial and murders. So in his mind was this, he was scared of them. He thought that looks like a cult. But later, even though he had that thought, he would end up joining them for 30 years because he saw them later after the event. And he went back to talk to them because something drew him to them. I think he had dropped out of college by this time. And he said that they were eating sandwiches and they looked a lot more casual and approachable than they had earlier. And he just said, he was asking them questions, and he said, would you like to recite the sinner's prayer right now and drop to your knees? And, and he said, yeah, for some reason he said yes. Because
what is the sinner's prayer?
It's just it's a verse that actually is not from the Bible, but often would be used as a recruiting tool. And it did result in this sort of out-of-body experience. He recited it, and then he said he stood up and he felt changed by this. But it turned out that David Berg, he didn't know the name of the group. And they said, why don't you join us? And in other words, he kept taking small steps towards it, and pretty soon he found himself on the bus with this group. They still didn't know the name of it, and they were all testifying about how they had, been converted. And he was asked to, add to the testimony, and he started talking about J.D. Salinger because he was just an alienated youth, basically, and nobody understood what he was talking about. They all just started singing and covering up his words, and he thought several times of leaving and getting off the bus, going to see his ex-girlfriend. He had just broken up with his girlfriend, but he ended up staying, and he ended up marrying 3 women, and just
3?
well, at first it was 1. They had an arranged marriage, and then it turned out this guy who ran a group, David Berg, he was a former furniture salesman. He then had some, you know, he believed that he got these messages direct from the Almighty. The messages told him that he needed to ramp up his recruiting by having women do this practice called flirty fishing, where they would go out and basically seduce men into the cult. And then he started introducing these practices where they were supposed to have sex with children, because his idea was that this was natural. And so many generations of kids were raised in this cult with this, were either trafficked or abused. I mean, it's really horrific. And Ray Connolly's interesting because he didn't engage in those things. He did end up having 17 children in the cult. But he...
17 kids.
I think he did have 17. He's a fascinating person because he left and he spent his time supporting survivors, and which is very unusual.
What about his 17 kids?
And they came out too.
How does he have time for anything else?
I don't know. They're now
kids?
mostly grown because he's quite elderly. But I guess it's interesting to hear him talk about how he saw the group changing and how what started out to be this profound experience, soon he called it a dark hamster wheel of the soul. Like, he was caught and it became this, basically they were exploiting him in his middle-aged years. He rose in sort of mid-level bureaucracy within the cult. But anyway, this cult, Children of God, has, and today still exists, has a different name.
They still have the same practices?
No, they say they reformed. But many people are still pursuing lawsuits against them, things like that, who are adults today. They had, groups throughout the world, and they would move kids around and things like that.
The Manson family is a fascinating one, right? Because I know that you have studied Jolly West and the whole MK Ultra program and what they were experimenting with psychedelic drugs and cults and mind control. What is your perspective on why they were doing that? Why Jolly West was involved? Why were they involved? What do you think was the initial motivation to sort of pursue mind control studies, the federal government?
I think the initial motivation was a kind of national internal emergency, national security emergency that emerged right after World War II, actually at the beginning of the Korean War, when U.S. Pilots were coming back or were shown confessing to having flown germ warfare missions over China, and then many POWs were coming back and seemed to have been converted to communism or have been concerningly affected by something that was seen as brainwashing. So many of the soldiers coming back seem to have been brainwashed or have collaborated to some degree when they were held as prisoners. And then there were 21 U.S. POWs who elected to stay in China, and this really was a disturbing. They all had a chance to choose when they were in the UN camps after they'd been held prisoner for 4 years or so, and 21 of them decided that they'd like to try their lot in China. And so this caused this kind of collective, caused a crisis of, did the communists possess a super weapon of some kind that no other war. There was even a famous article in the New Yorker that said something new in history, that there was some capacity that this ideological system had, the communists had, that was somehow rendering Americans powerless against it. So this was kind of the crisis of mind control, and MK Ultra was an attempt to basically reverse engineer what this was. So Jolly West was one of the first people. He was in charge of studying the brainwashed pilots initially, and that's how he.
What year was services?
That was in 52. But he also, before that, he was involved. I mean, he had been trained to some degree with. He was trained by Harold Wolff, who was at Cornell. He had done his residency at Cornell with Dr. Harold Wolff, who is a neurologist, a world expert in migraine and basically the type of pain that comes from migraine. So you could say he was an expert in the fear pain cycle. And he had CIA connections from even before MK Ultra was started.
So what did they determine the Chinese were doing?
So they determined, West wrote a paper in 1957, and the part that was published in a journal called Sociometry described, he described it as DDD, or debility, dependency, and dread. And he said basically these camps were systematically inducing a state of debility, which was that soldiers were starved and basically worn down. They were deprived of medical care. This is also in the historical record. Something I studied extensively is that, men were marched, and, for example, the Tiger Death March north of the Yali River from the war, where they'd been captured, and by the time they got there, they'd often lost half their body weight. They had been bombed by their own forces at night. They'd sometimes, they had to pour the blood out of their boots every morning just to keep going and not be, anyone who stopped would be shot. So by the time they got to the camps, they were really worn down. And a missionary who passed them in a train at that time wrote or described in an oral history that he didn't recognize them as Americans, that they were the most bedraggled. That it was just they were in a terrible state. And so debility was the first thing West described when he was extracting what had happened. Dependency was, later there was a layer added in which the POWs were dependent for all if they were going to survive, they required, the camp leaders would provide it, so it made them very dependent, and they also engaged in very formal Maoist thought reform with the men as a kind of experiment. And the third part was dread, which was just the idea that you could be killed at any time, or perhaps your family could be, because they threatened
Maoist thought reform?
Yeah, that in the POW camps, once the Chinese took over from the Koreans running the camps, because they decided, I think it was almost a formal experiment, at least that's how it looks to me. I don't think West wrote about this, but in my own research on the camps, it transpires that they wanted to see, because Mao believed that thought reform would work on anybody, not just on Chinese people, not just on Chinese peasants. He felt that only something like 7 to 8% of the human population was unreformable, and those people would be disposed of. But he wanted to check if these American soldiers would also be susceptible to re-education. So they really did a formal, 3-part re-education program on them. And men had many different responses to it. But when West met them, he studied many of the returning men when they came back to Lackland Air Force Base, and he extracted those three components of what had happened to them. DDD, and that's the way he became an expert on what he called brainwashing or coercive persuasion.
So how do they go from that to like sponsoring the Manson family and Operation Midnight Climax and all the crazy stuff that they were doing?
Yeah, it may seem like a leap, but
Sort of.
It's sort of a leap, but it's sort of not. I think that MK Ultra was funded around in direct response to this crisis of the POWs, and in addition to reverse engineering what had happened to them, they also wanted to turn it into a weapon and continue certain programs in interrogation procedures and making them more effective. So MK Ultra just had a wide reach, and it was pretty free reign. It was a free reign program, and the historian Alfred McCoy says it was modeled on the Los Alamos in a way, a kind of Manhattan Project for the mind. So just as the atom had been disassembled and, transformed into this new world had emerged from that program, that intensive exertion of scientific acumen, the same
for the cause!
Put a dent in him! Let's get cracking.
Well, that was satisfying.
Put a dent in him!
My prey thinks it's so clever.
Taste to your heart's content.
That's how Anima Squad gets it done.
The city's future is riding on Anima Squad's shoulders.
My streets!
innocent cry out.
Support for the cause!
Yeah! Teamwork!
The dark forgive me.
Support for the cause!